Viator and Terra seeks to bring the latest scholarship in medieval times to a general audience. Popular consciousness is rife with misconceptions and myths about medieval times, owing to inertia in the school system, peer education, or just plain laziness. However, our mission needs time and effort to bring about. We're only students not even in medieval studies, but we have great passion towards this interesting and often misunderstood time period. We ask only for the smallest support from our audience. One may find links to our Ko-Fi page and our merchandise store in the description below. In a previous video, we discussed misconceptions regarding medieval times and feudalism that came from outdated concepts and notions in medieval studies. One subject that we discussed involved conceptions of statehood and political communities. The old medievalist understanding claimed that medieval society recognized no division between public and private spheres of life, and no conception of the res publica, or public affairs, existed among citizens and subjects. As we will discuss, however, the political community as a body united in purpose of mutual well-being was a dominant political theory at that time. It is clear that the end of a multitude gathered together is to live virtuously. For men form a group for the purpose of living well together, a thing which the individual man living alone could not attain, and good life is virtuous life. Therefore, virtuous life is the end for which men gather together. The evidence for this lies in the fact that only those who render mutual assistance to one another in living well form a genuine part of an assembled multitude. If men assembled merely to live, then animals and slaves would form a part of the civil community. Or, if men assembled only to accrue wealth, then all those who traded together would belong to one city. Yet we see that only such are regarded as forming one multitude, as are directed by the same laws and the same government to live well. For this part, we will discuss what medievalists thought of statehood and corresponding medieval realities. What a state depends on who uses the word, but a common definition in political science is the declarative definition. A state is a legal person in international law if it has a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and sovereignty. Previous conceptions of a state, coming from Max Weber, had strict and rigid norms about what constituted a state. Sociologists and political scientists denied statehood to many pre-modern polities for fluid boundaries, ineffective control within them, autonomy, partial or not, of lesser authorities within them, or their lack of sovereignty, however defined. Most importantly, authors like Murray Rothbard defined a state as a monopoly of violence over a fixed territory, which medieval times had none of. Private use of violence happened among common people. Susan Reynolds, whose work we tackled in a previous video, went against this grain and gave a new definition of the state. I offer the following, which is based on Max Weber with some modification. A state is an organization of human society within a fixed territory that more or less successfully claims the control, not the monopoly, of the legitimate use of physical force within that territory. She notes that denying statehood to medieval polities on the grounds above would mean denying it to a good many modern states as well. Her work sparked discussion in both the medieval studies and international relations scholarship. Two broad schools of thought emerged. First, we have scholars who claim that medieval times followed heteronomy, the lack of consistent patterns in medieval political organization. This school began with John Gerard Ruggie, who outlined how the medieval order consisted of chains of lord-vassal relationships. Its basis was fief, which was an amalgam of conditional property and private authority. Property was conditional in that it carried with it explicit social obligations, and authority was private, in that the rights of jurisdiction administration over the inhabitants of a fiefdom resided personally in the ruler. Moreover, the prevailing concept of usufructure meant that multiple titles to the same landed property were the norm. As a result, the medieval system of rule reflected a patchwork of overlapping and incomplete rights of government, which were inextricably superimposed and tangled, and in which different juridical instances were geographically interwoven and stratified, and plural allegiances, asymmetrical suzerainties, and anomalous enclaves abounded. The next school, which began with Susan Reynolds' There did exist medieval states which claimed sovereignty, or supreme power with jurisdiction over territory. This school limited itself to after the crisis of the 12th century, allowing for heteronomy to exist before. Reynolds herself defines the state as an organization of human society within a more or less fixed area in which the ruler or governing body more or less successfully controls the legitimate use of physical force. This definition is based on Max Weber's definition of a modern state, but is adapted to focus on the difference between societies in which the control of physical force is formally located and those in which it is not. I differ from Weber in referring to control rather than monopoly, and in the insertions of more or less. Weber apparently thought that monopoly made his definition specific to the modern state, but some modern polities that are presumably reckoned to be states, like the United States, claim control rather than monopoly, and not all claim either very successfully. While Reynolds admits that sovereignty is difficult to define, later authors like Andrew Latham now define sovereignty as a supreme political source to command, legislate, and judge within a territory. With all this being said, we can now discuss both schools further. The Heteronomy school of medieval politics holds that medieval times saw a political order with heterogeneous forms of political rule. While heteronomists disagree on details, three broad features appeared in medieval rule. Political rule was not exclusive or territorialized, but distributed into overlapping jurisdictions. Political rule was private, with ruler and property owner the same. Contrary to modern secular states, medieval society saw conflict between secular rulers and church clergy. Talk about the Middle Ages is to imply the existence of certain social institutions, such as feudalism and personalistic, rather than impersonal or state politics. It is to refer to traditional, rather than legal, rational legitimacy, and to controversies between temporal and spiritual authority, rather than sovereign supremacy. Ruggie saw this order as inherently international. A blurry distinction lay between internal and external political realms. Rulers could be lord or vassal for different regions of their lands, and the feudal ruling class could travel and govern from one end of Europe to another without difficulty. Most importantly, common bodies of law, religion, and custom gave legitimacy to the medieval order. Units like the family, guilds, parishes, villages, cities, or entire tracts of land saw themselves included in a greater whole with corresponding natural rights and duties. In turn, each unit saw itself as representative of the whole and felt no threats to their integrity. Ruggie contrasted the medieval order, which fused medieval norms on property and rulership to the modern one. He outlines the modern order. Private property is exclusionary, without further social obligations. Political rule is total, fully integrating all authorities into the public realm. Public political rule now lies in mutually exclusive jurisdictions. Firm boundaries exist between realms, and rulers rule only within them. Unlike the medieval order, a split between public and private on one hand, and between internal and external on the other hand, dominates modern politics. These developments mean that a monopoly on legitimate use of force and violence now belongs to a central authority. The first realms to be modern, in Ruggie's view, were the absolute monarchies that dominated the 17th century. Here, the king's wars and the kingdom's wars became one and the same, and the kings did away with castles, knights, and feudal wars to hold that monopoly. Wars in Europe took a national character, going from wars for dynastic succession to wars for territory and empires. Rees Davies goes one step further and claims that using the word state for medieval times applies modern historiography inappropriately to earlier periods. References to a great diversity of state forms before 1800, or several hundred state units in Europe of the ancient regime, are examples of Davies' warnings. He points out that the interplay of power and society in medieval times conforms more to heteronomy than notions of the state similar to modernity. He quotes an Irish historian: "In a bureaucratic polity, there is a state apparatus distinct from civil society. There are thus powers exercised upon society by the organs of the state. Early Irish kings, by contrast, worked within the powers available within society at large. There was not a state distinct from society, but rather a king who was central within society, whose power was effective, partly because he deployed the same powers as did other lords, but to a higher degree." For Davies, the nature and dynamics of power exist only in their social and local contexts, and applying the notion of the state to medieval times distorts their views of the times period. Even in England, where primary sources exist in great detail, our view of the time period comes only from sources that show society engaged with royal power. He says that focus never shown on other pivots for power, whether ideological, economic, social, or military. Medievalists had already noticed how community power opposed that of lords and kings, and if the latter were not matched, they were at least contained. Some had also called for modern notions of separate state and society to be done away with. Society and the state are not separate, they interpenetrate with each other. Davies summarizes his position. The categories, assumptions, and discourse the post-1800s state, notably the nation-state, are not fully commensurate with the realities of the medieval world. The state was not a fully differentiated organization which we take for granted today. Power was not necessarily delegated from some putative center, as contemporary legal formulations, especially by royalist lawyers and the habits of modern constitutional historians, often suggest. Power in most pre-industrial societies was extensive and essentially federal, not unitary, hierarchical, and centralist. Charisma was not exclusively a royal prerogative. It could equally be claimed by an aristocracy which, as in Germany, defended and explained its power by reference to divine grace. It is the uniqueness of the English experience, not its normality, which stands out in this, as in so many other respects. As an alternative, Davies suggests that we refer to medieval realms as lordships instead of states. He refers to his own experience with lords who ruled lands on the border with Wales. Here, the marcher lordships raised their own taxes, waged war, sent ambassadors, and conducted diplomacy with neighboring lordships. For Davies, the word lordships respects what he calls the continuum of power. While the marcher lordships acted like sovereign states, medievalists had long seen them as mere landowners who awaited absorption into the English state. The term, he says, is necessarily relative, but there lay its appeal. It privileged no show of power against all others. In contrast, studies of the state abstract it from society so much that it becomes a free-floating superstructure of power. The Heteronomy school reflects the larger presentist approach in international relations towards history. Presentism means using the present as a default frame of reference in discussing historical topics, and heteronomists hold that sovereignty is a distinctively modern organizing principle. The idea of a supreme authority holding the highest power in a defined territory dates to early modern times. While the late medieval view held that princes and lords must either rule under law or become tyrants, jurists like John Bodine and liberals like Thomas Hobbes held that they alone could enforce and rule under divine and natural law, not human one. Law and sovereign command were one and the same, law proceeding not from wise men but from the sovereign. They, however, separated government and sovereignty. Now, government meant the institutions through which the sovereign ruled, whereas Bodine's thought had medieval remnants, like taxation being subject to citizens' consent. The liberal thinkers that succeeded him sought a Leviathan's rule over society for its own safety and security. contrasting the Heteronomy school were medievalists who had just broken from the tyranny of the feudal construct. No less than Susan Reynolds herself first responded to Davies' work. While she agrees with most of it, her concerns lie in the greater trend of medievalists isolating themselves from fields with which they could discuss with. I quite agree in deploring the fashion for using the word state in discussions of medieval polities without any explanation of the category to which the supposed state belongs and why it belongs there. I also quite agree that we should not go back to the old political history and its concentration on high politics, or join in the teleological search for the origins of modern states. But politics and power matter. Historians who live in societies in which power is exercised in part through states have reason to think about the characteristics of this kind of polity, whether states existed in the periods they study, and the difference between societies with and without states. In other words, we should neither blindly follow the fashion for using the word nor stubbornly avoid it. But as Davies suggests, think about our prior category assumptions when we use it. She points out how the presentist approach have made historians focus on a few traits. Whether the absolutism, standing armies, regular taxes, bureaucracies, or professional diplomacy, that a transition from medieval to modern features, or communications, education systems, or economic policies in general contrast with traditional states before the French Revolution. While these describe particular sorts of states well enough, their novelty points to how earlier works treated earlier realms and polities. Indeed, Reynolds notices how European historians think in terms of their own states, their respective histories, and other characteristics. She highlights the importance of separating terms from phenomenon, as she did in Fiefs and Vassals. The last thing I want to do is extend this habit of fitting the definition to particular periods or countries, so as to use the word state in a sense consonant with medieval practice. Doing that virtually rules out the kind of serious comparisons of polities and periods that we need if we are to turn mere assumptions about variance and changes into solid arguments based on evidence about each of the phenomena that one is comparing. It seems to me easier to compare if one uses a common vocabulary with some definition or recognition of the accepted sense of the key terms in it. The prevalent tendency to equate state with modern state cannot be accepted or questioned unless one says what one means by state and looks at earlier polities. Reynolds herself gives a definition of the word state, which she first explains in Fiefs and Vassals. She uses this definition in all her following works. With this in mind, she gives some differences among societies and polities. Some have legitimate force and coercion formally under specific persons or institutions. These societies, which count as states by modern measures, themselves have variations of economic, social, political structures, ideologies, size, internal power structures, and much else. Federal and unitary states also raise questions as to impersonal and differentiated institutions. Medieval polities also varied, but more than what the construct of feudalism suggested. Reynolds thus concludes about medieval polities. A good many medieval polities, whether kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, other lordships, or city-states, could be classified as states, not because they want to bestow an almost endless elasticity on the word and concept, but because the evidence they have looked at suggests that they exercised a more or less successful control of the legitimate use of physical force within their borders. That does not mean that they eliminated crimes or even armed revolts, or even punished all or most of them, or that all their subjects regarded all that their rulers did as legitimate. To demand that would disqualify many modern states. What I argue is that the kind of control they exercised, with varying degrees of success, puts them in the category I have defined. I even included a good deal of post-Carolingian France as an area of unstable mini-states. Unstable and very small, but still states. She goes on by discussing evidence from France. The 11th and 12th centuries saw maybe 90% of the population live under coercive controls, which they were likely to have accepted as more or less legitimate. as their descendants did under larger and more stable units of jurisdiction and government. Seeing any statelessness in this time would have come from focusing on relatively few people who recorded their disputes in cartularies and chronicles. Reynolds also counts the Welsh marcher lords, whom Davies discussed, as states in their own right. How they existed in England's peripheries, or how they lost their independence afterwards, take nothing from their real existence as states. Reynolds ends her piece on this note. The only thing, I suspect, that we really disagree about is the vocabulary. He is afraid, to quote from an email he sent me, that using a common vocabulary can lead to an unthinking assumption about concepts and phenomena, so that historians unthinkingly equate the state with the modern state. I share his fears, but I would rather be more optimistic. I want to believe that medievalists may gradually come to pay more attention to what non-European historians and scholars in other disciplines have to say about states, and learn to use the vocabulary more critically and analytically. I also cling to the hope that modernists may gradually learn to pay more attention to a great chunk of European history that has more in it than they learned in school or as undergraduates. Maybe the kind of discussion that Rees Davies has inaugurated will help. As she wanted, medieval studies has further defined its historiography of statehood. We now have a clear view of how the idea of sovereignty developed in medieval thought. The 12th century saw crisis, Reformation, Renaissance, and economic development all at once. Among these events was the rediscovery of the Roman civil law, which introduced the concept of supreme authority to jurists, legal theorists, and lawyers. The old order had seen the right to judge legal cases and enforce them go from public Carolingian authorities into the hands of magnates and lesser lords. The crisis of the 12th century thus saw private justice and private war prevail. However, the crisis end saw kings and their officials look for ways to restore their judicial primacy. The concept of king as supreme authority, princeps civitatis like the old Roman emperors, was a direct influence of the Roman civil law. Here, rulers were the first of their realms. Of course, the Roman Empire's institutions were not replicated exactly. Medieval civilians, for their part, were not interested in the constitutional history of the Roman Empire, but instead in making sense of and extracting a coherent set of legal principles from Roman law. They were trained in dialectical argumentation and saw as their task the resolution of the apparent contradictions in Justinian's codification. Because the ancient Roman jurists did not elucidate upon the emperor's authority and prerogatives in any detail, the medieval jurists had to shape their conception of imperial authority with very few points of reference. Medieval jurists and legal theorists understood the Roman law in the context of their own understandings about political institutions in their own time. Nonetheless, they saw a model of ancient imperial authority that they used as a paradigm for imperial power in their own day. In the medieval understanding, the political community was a sovereign body which, first, possessed a distinctive legal personality, second, had its own unique customs, purpose, and composition, and third, was made of individual people that held an abstract unity. As the political community was a body, it also had a head. This head embodied the political community's legal person and could act autonomously on its behalf. However, the body placed strict limits on the head's actions. First and foremost, the head had to honor the body's customs and constitution. It also had to seek members' counsel and consent, all for their best interest. Breaching these customs meant grounds for removal. We can summarize how late medieval realms worked with these points. 1. Late medieval realms were sovereign only with respect to temporal affairs. It shared sovereignty with the church in spiritual matters. 2. In the late Middle Ages, sovereignty involved the control, rather than monopoly, over legitimate violence. 3. In the late Middle Ages, sovereignty was vested in the political community as a body rather than, as in the modern era, the state. 4. Late medieval sovereignty was exercised unevenly, in that sometimes it was exercised through intermediary powers with substantial autonomy. 5. In the late Middle Ages, sovereignty was not always reciprocally recognized, especially between kingdoms and lesser realms. While we have talked of princes, lords, and kings, they were not the only power brokers in medieval times. While they were the supreme authority, they were not the only authorities. While geographically limited under one prince, medieval realms saw political power fractured, overlapping, and concurrent. All power brokers had their own means to enforce their own political legitimacy, from village fraternities and associations to kings and their courts. These power brokers acted as centers where society gathered around. Kings and other princes acted as the governing center for their realms, while other organizations like guilds, dioceses, villages, or families followed the center's demands. Nothing stopped them from being centers to their own locales. These local power brokers could even band together to stop a king whom they saw became too powerful. One could say that medieval society comprised many centers, from which we say medieval times had polycentric sovereignty. Princes acted as supreme authority, while other power brokers acted within their bounds as their own centers. To start with, private violence was a common occurrence in medieval times. Barbara Hanawalt's compiled data on English crime shows how common private defenses of property and body were against robbers and rapists, among other violent activity. Anglo-Saxon custom in fact made it mandatory for able-bodied men to go after criminals caught in the act, and exact justice on their own terms as necessary. The hue and cry, as it was known, remained custom until the first police forces were set up in England. Polycentrism also meant that dispute mediations was not just the king's domain. While justice was handed down in his name, citizens had access to local, urban, and regional courts to settle disputes. They chose judicial venues for specific conflicts, and even shopped around for courts that gave them higher odds for winning cases. Regional differences in courts persisted even within the same jurisdiction. Peasants in the Low Countries had an archetypal experience with selecting judicial venues. Campine peasants therefore had a wide range of judicial venues that they could access to plead their case and were bound to be heard. Their negotiations on the informal or formal, local or regional level were often fruitful, and were one of the reasons that their communal privileges and communal property survived the later Middle Ages. Of course, not all peasants or citizens had the same agency or influence in different courts. Some communities also kept rights or privileges, while others encountered increasing outside influence. Regional differences mattered most in a time when the local mattered more to daily life than the realm did. A trend also developed where courts under lords and princes favored peasants and citizens more than local and urban courts did. De Keyser notes that the Council of Brabant, the sovereign and most expensive court in the duchy, became a favored venue for peasants to settle their cases. The Council of Flanders held the same prestige in its own country over local courts, as did the rest of the Low Countries. Villagers that wanted to protect their communal and property rights could approach sovereign courts and count on their favor. Even modest peasants, owning no more than 5 to 10 hectares of land, approached sovereign courts despite their costs. A widely spread tale shows how popular the image of sovereign rulers were in the Low Countries. A bailiff had stolen a cow from a poor household that had refused to sell it to him. To complain about this matter, the poor farmer went to Count William III and pleaded for justice. The count ordered that the farmer be compensated, but he stated the bailiff's punishment for failing toward the count would be much more grave. The bailiff was, in the end, sent to the executioner. The count was seen as an avenging ruler who looked after the lowly's interests. Of course, bailiffs and aldermen worked for sovereign rulers' interests despite the former's popular image as corrupt officials. Bureaucracy had become mainstay after the crisis of the 12th century, for realms needed delegates to enforce the king's wants. Medieval times and so increasing royal power over those of nobles and aristocrats. The Low Countries' experience points to a larger trend of kings spreading a benevolent image among subjects to foster a tacit alliance against potential threats to power. These changes forever changed the nature of state and society. The introduction of permanent armies during the very end of the 15th century was not only the result of the evolution of institutions, a higher level of economic activity, or even improved systems of taxation. The standing armies were also a product of changes in the attitudes towards war. One of the conditions of possibility of their emergence were changes in the social function and role of the warring classes, from private feudal lords to servants of the public interest of the sovereign. In other words, the King's War had to become the Kingdom's War, and rulers such as Charles VII of France were towards the mid-15th century actively trying to break the privileged allegiance of the soldiers to certain princes or lords, and were now claiming for themselves alone the right to wage war. Nobles lost their function as warriors and commanders in their own right, and became mere subsidiaries to the king to help lead his armies. The state, especially the person of the king, became the only one that could give men or women the right to bear arms. The military revolution also favored large, centralized states for artillery and gunpowder work best in mass, organized armies. War had become a wholly public business. Mercenaries and standing armies fought for the realm as vested in the monarch. Most of all, the polycentric nature of medieval society saw itself get torn apart as the powerful seek to rid themselves of rivals. The state's claim to monopolize the legitimate means of violence did not emerge ex nihilo, but was rather the result of a long process through which private force was increasingly bound to public service. The claim of the monopoly of the armed forces was not effective as long as the territory was constantly pillaged by roving companies of bandits. For a long time, the rulers' claims of the monopoly of the right to make war conflicted with the fact that large portions of the population were constantly under arms. By establishing regular standing armies, the king could now put an end to the plundering of mercenaries in peacetime through fighting them, but also by eliminating their appearance at the end of wars, since the king's soldiers now kept their functions also in times of peace. Come the 17th century, Europe saw formerly autonomous organizations became mere arms of the king. Guilds now needed royal charters, armies needed royal patronage, local councils needed the king's permission to meet, even religious organizations needed the king's permission to stay. Polycentric society would collapse under violence and misrule as the absolute monarchs established themselves. A new order had formed, forever changing the world. Bertrand de Jouvenel, a political theorist, gives a poignant reason to how this order came to be. Power, in search of resources, attacks the princes of society who got in first. For what purpose are wealth and strength but to hold in this position a mass of human labor and energies? Power, which needs them for itself, must therefore start by detaching them from their first overlords. Thus, in the time of its expansion, power's predestined victims and natural enemies are the powerful, the men with payrolls, and those who wield authority in society and are strong in it. To attack them, power need feel for them no conscious hostility. With animal instinct, it overthrows what irks it and devours what nourishes it. All command other than its own, that is what irks power. All energy, whatever it may be found, that is what nourishes it. If the human atom which contains this energy is confined in a social molecule, then power must break down that molecule. We can keep talking about knights and mercenaries, about the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, about wars among Castile, Aragon, and the Spanish polities. For now, however, we shall forego discussing further how the medieval order gave way to the modern one. This topic needs an entire video on its own, where we shall tackle the new monarchies, the military revolution's socio-political effects, and finally, the rise of absolutism. Et semper rememorator, non omnes vagantes aberarunt.